Hello, Internet. Friendly neighborhood marriage and family therapist, Jeremy Schumacher. I'm the Jer in Wellness with Jer. Thanks for stopping by and checking out the channel. Today, you could be anywhere on the internet, and you're here with me. Today, we're going to talk about realistic expectations for unmasking. As a late diagnosed ADHDer myself, as a therapist with 17 years of practice, some of which was not diagnosed. I was diagnosed pretty early in my career, although it was in my postgrad when I got diagnosed with ADHD. It was later for the autism. But yeah, this is a thing that I specialize in now, working with a lot of late diagnosed folks, sometimes doing the diagnosis for those people, sometimes helping those people learn to understand and grow in what management looks like and what healthy unmasking can look like. Because I think masking is not one of those like internet cultural zeitgeist type things like gaslighting is, where whenever people use it, I like roll my eyes and like, you're using that incorrectly. And it drives me a little batty. I do think a lot of people talk about masking in a way that is unrealistic more than I would say unhelpful. I love the online communities that name and center social performance and masking for safety reasons. I love the spaces that want and encourage people to be authentic and learn how to unmask. And one of the things that I tell my clients often is like, you're not going to unmask everywhere all the time. That just quite simply is unrealistic. Not because I don't want it for people, but because it isn't safe for people, because our society was not set up with neurodivergent folks in mind. Our society was set up with like a very specific subset of neurodivergent thinking in mind. And I'm somebody who doesn't necessarily maintain that neurotypical is a thing that exists. I think that's an overstated concept. So really looking at the umbrella of neurodivergence that is understood to be ADHD, ASD, autism spectrum disorder, and sensory processing disorder. So I jotted some things down that I want to respond to. The first big misconception and thing that is unrealistic is unmasking means you're going to be authentic 100% of the time. I don't think anyone's authentic 100% of the time. Now, understand this is coming from somebody who masked most of their life. In a way that before I was diagnosed, I was described as I'm a social chameleon, which is my outward interaction with other people is always shaped by the environment I was in. And I think on some level, I knew from a young age to do that. I can generally say, if you want my whole history, go listen to any of the podcasts I've guested on. But around 10 is when I know my ADHD hit in a different way. I started to get bored. I didn't want to go to school anymore. I didn't want to go to heaven. I was raised fundamentalist religious, so that was a big deal. So that was when I think there were a lot of things that coalesced for me. I also went to private school because I was religious, but we were poor. And so there was a lot of like social stress, unaware, unbeknownst, subconsciously for myself to fit in a way where that was a really big difference for me. I didn't have people over to my house, et cetera, et cetera. So my bias to say I don't think anyone shows up authentically is certainly framed by my lived experience of not showing up authentically and being a warm, welcoming, kind person, in the sense that I've made my career on making people feel comfortable. I am an introvert, and yet people in public approach me way more than I would like, because apparently I give off enough Midwest vibes that people think I'm approachable, or they think I have weed. That's really common, actually, is people assume I have drugs on me, which I don't. I don't have drugs on me, but I look like somebody who'd party. Haha, I'm an introvert. That sounds terrible. So unmasking is not authenticity all the time. I think everybody, to a degree, with mild exceptions, right? I think most people do shifts and wear different hats and put on different flavors of their personality. They turn the volume up or down on pieces of themselves based on the environment they're in. And some of that's my lived experience saying that, but a lot of that is that I'm a LMFT. I'm a licensed marriage and family therapist. Family dynamics shift and change how we show up. And so if you go to a family reunion, if you go to a holiday gathering and your siblings are there, you show up differently than how you might around your friend group or with, just one person versus a group of people. Like those dynamics, the environment that we exist in does exert pressure on us to show up a certain way. So it's not just masking, some of it is also environmental. But again, if you mask to be functional at work, if you mask to fit in, if you mask to not stick out in a way that makes you have concerns about your safety, if this is an adaptive trait that you learned for safety reasons, you have to do some of the mental work to figure out, is the context you're in now currently safe to unmask, or was that adaptive trait for survivability still very valid for what you need right now for your survivability? Because it certainly, as the internet and culture writ large has become more aware of neurodivergence, we haven't made a ton of shifts or changes in our society. Here in America, in the United States, we are having a cultural backlash right now to things like accommodation and appreciation of diversity, and other countries are at a different place with that. So I think it is unfortunately realistic, a necessary practical idea that you will still have to mask, and that masking as an intentional choice can still be healthy and fine. It's a sustainable practice to say I need to do what I need to do to be safe in different environments. That's not a bad thing. I do, especially working with late diagnosed folks, push for, hope for, try to help them build a space where they can be themselves, where they don't have to mask, and being able to start to differentiate where and when we can unmask, and to what degree, because again, it's not always full authenticity all the time. Again, I don't think anyone does that. I don't think anyone does that. Um, so yeah, we want to get to a point where we can make some intentional choices as to when we're authentic and what that means, how much we unmask and why, as opposed to like authenticity is the goal all the time. Hooray, you're your final form. Like that's just, get out of here with that goop level nonsense. If you don't know what goop is, that's fine. Uh, it's a bullshit wellness thing. Gwyneth Paltrow, maybe, I don't know, some celebrity. If you can mask your high functioning, nah. Like again, I covered this a little bit in the earlier one. Not everybody who masks is high functioning. Masking sometimes is survival, and sometimes survival is just getting by, just getting through something safely. Certainly not thriving. It might not be high functioning. I really detest the high functioning language. We don't necessarily have better language because we're still, this is where I say like unmasking isn't always helpful, because our culture still hasn't adjusted to an appreciation of neurodiversity. And so we don't have spaces where that exists. We talk about health and wellness in the level of productivity and functioning, which like I don't love, but being well resourced and being able to, again, I think like talk about making these choices intentionally, whether we're unmasking or not, is helpful in the sense that we can look at the environment we're in and make a choice. Like that does imply a degree of resources to be able to slow that process down and make that call in real time, as opposed to survival mode, which might be high level masking just to get by, just to pay the bills, just to get through high school, just to wait till we can move out from our religious families, whatever the case may be. There's a lot of reasons where masking could be barely functioning or outright dysfunctional even with masking. So again, I think like masking, it's that old like ADHD is a superpower, which it's not. Like I've ranted on this before as somebody who loves superheroes. Like a superpower that you can't control is not a superpower. That's a major plot point in a ton of different superhero media, where suddenly we can't control our powers is a problem. It's a bad thing. And defining functionality as high or low and deciding whether someone's worth is high or low based on that level of functioning is like shitty. Don't do that. Um, The flip side of everybody masks to some degree is, I think, a disingenuous sort of bad faith argument that like masking is just polite society and everyone does it, and therefore you're not special or different because you've masked or because you need to mask. And again, it's a level of severity. It's a level of doing it often without intention in your developmental years, not realizing that you were needing to do it, not understanding why you felt compelled to do it, and also it's not always something that like we can turn on and off, whereas I think again being polite is. I have this conversation and hopefully I'll have some really smarter than me people on to elaborate on this, probably on the podcast Your Therapist Needs Therapy, check it out, to talk about the difference between masking and man between sorry, my dog's barking and it's distracting me. You probably can't hear it, but the masking and code switching, and I think masking and code switching are different. I've struggled to articulate it as a white person. I don't feel like I have had to code switch um in the United States again, uh where that's the privileged class. But some of it again comes down to intentionality. Some of it comes down to there's a lot of overlap that in those Venn diagrams. But it's certainly both those things are different than being polite. There's a survival aspect to code switching. There's a survival aspect to masking that isn't there for being polite. Polite is like, I understand the social norms and I'm going to follow them. I'm going to hit my expected norms because that either benefits me in fitting in or that gets me something with the people who have the authority right now. Whereas in masking and code switching, I think, and I'm not going to keep making this whole video about both those things. I want to do a separate, it deserves a separate topic for other people who can speak more to code switching than I can. Um, but politeness is again from a place of well resourced. Not that everybody loves to be polite all the time or hit their social norms, but when you are well resourced to do that, it's different than when you're doing it to not be socially ostracized, to not be cast out, to not be put in a position where you might be unsafe. And so again, unmasking is sometimes culturally relevant. Sometimes it's neurodiversity. Sometimes it's an identity thing. So there are different reasons and different levels. It scales differently depending on what environment we're in for masking. And so not the idea that everybody masks is not that neurodivergent masking isn't another level. Because again, there's just a cognitive there's just so much mental work that has to go into that politeness doesn't. It sort of becomes rote and almost a thing you practice and get good at, and then you don't have to think about it anymore. Masking, you're always thinking about it. Unmasking will make you feel better instantly. Again, I think this is some of that like authenticity at all costs is the goal, and it's not. Any therapist who works with neurodivergence is not asking you to unmask all the time, and is certainly not laying that out as the goal. I think people who work with this wisely are again trying to get to a point where you can be intentional with when you're masking, to what degree you're masking, and when you get to unmask. Um, and why you unmask. And I think that looks different than sort of the space where unmasking it always equals good. Like unmasking sometimes is when we get to feel exhausted. Unmasking can be when we feel grief, when we feel angry, when we don't follow our social norms. And so if we do those things, depending on what context we do those things in, we may not be feeling particularly good or safe about where we're at. And I think that can definitely be a problem. Masking is generally doing something protective. And so if we're in a space where we still need to be protected, we still have to mask. Unmasking won't feel good. It'll feel unsafe. And that's not a benefit, right? Now, sometimes we unmask and we still feel unsafe, and there's a difference. Again, it's still unfortunately mental labor, but the idea that we do need to assess: are we actually unsafe, or do we feel uncomfortable? Because those are different things. Um, I am going to use phobias, which is not a straight one-to-one analogy here, but as a metaphor, like I go into the lizard and reptile building at our local zoo, and there's a bunch of spiders in there, and I don't like spiders, and I certainly don't like the big ass spiders that are in the zoo. Um, I'm deeply uncomfortable. I'm an arachnophobe, and they're behind glass. They can't get out. Blah 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 blah. Like I am safe, and I feel My brain is saying unsafe. That creepy crawly thing is yucky and makes my skin crawl, and I need to get out of here. And there's a difference between that and, I don't know, being out in the wild and there's a rattlesnake rattling next to you. And like, again, as somebody who's not afraid of snakes, like that doesn't trigger that same level of discomfort for me. But when we've masked our whole lives and we unmask, sometimes we're going to feel unsafe in situations that are safe. Sometimes we're going to feel uncomfortable, and being able to work through, are we uncomfortable or is this a crisis? As two very different things. And teaching our brain, learning, growing with our brain, how to be able to respond to those different situations, I think is really helpful. Oftentimes, again, unmasking is going to make us feel a little bit worse early on in the process than it's going to make us feel better. Especially there's like disorientation, and again, as we show up in different spaces unmasked, other people are going to relate to us differently, and so there's a systemic and ecosystem that needs to reach a new homeostasis, and that takes some time. Um, Masking is lying, and again, I think this pushes the idea that authenticity at all costs is the goal. If masking is lying, then unmasking is being truthful and honest, and that is better. So we should always unmask. And again, I don't know. I'm not here to defend polite society, but like I think for most of us, I don't know. I'm ADHD, right? There are pieces of me that are masked in polite society for good reason, because I would be unlikable, unmasked all the time. Again, there's utility to some of our thoughts are inside thoughts. Some of our ideas and things we're thinking about aren't helpful for other people to hear and aren't going to land well. I grew up in a super sarcastic family. It was a way to emotionally bypass, the spiritually bypass. Again, is raised fundy. So that sarcasm as a form of humor can be really, really funny sometimes in some context. And sarcasm isn't a great form of humor in most contexts. It actually plays really poorly a lot of the time. But if I'm together with my siblings who are also pretty quick-witted and like wordplay and are comfortable not being in touch with their emotions, sarcasm's great. You can get a really good laugh sometimes, right? And so I think that idea of it's lying or truthful, like I don't know, I have a sense of humor. That doesn't mean being sarcastic is a more honest version of me than like a kind or even polite, which I don't put a lot of weight on, like being polite for politeness sake. And there's utility, especially for neurodivergent people, to have some version of a script, not necessarily lying, not necessarily inauthentic, but have something that is structured for us to be able to follow that makes socializing a little bit easier. And again, I think it's is that flexible? Is that a living, breathing relational thing, or is that sort of dogmatic? Is the difference there? Um, the next couple things I jotted down, yeah, they sort of relate. If people loved you, you wouldn't need to mask. I don't think it's about love at all. I don't think it's even necessarily acceptance. I think a lot of times it's social pressure and it's in our developmental years, so we don't even realize it's going on. And we're around a bunch of brains that also aren't developed. So even if they're neurotypical, whatever that means, um, they're exerting social pressure and they're not necessarily in any more position to make that as an intentional choice than you are. Putting a bunch of undeveloped brains in a room together for 9 hours a day, I won't say it's bad, but like comes with some risks. And so a lot of the social pressure we get is from family of origin, but it can certainly be from our peer groups. It can certainly be from culture through media and pop culture type things. Um, so it's not about love. Again, I think there's a difference between acceptance. I think there's a difference between tolerating and appreciating. And most of our cultural, capital C cultures, don't have an appreciation of neurodivergence beyond like a dead author appreciation, right? Saying like, that guy was brilliant and he also cut off his ear. Like we like to glamorize it after the fact oftentimes, but yeah, it's not about whether we're loved or not. It's often social pressure and social norms that nobody is being super intentional about, and we feel pressure. And we feel pressure because there's legitimate pressure within an ecosystem exerting it towards homeostasis, and that is norming culture, that is heteronormativity, um, whatever wherever you're at, the dominant culture exerts pressure on social norming, and so um, yeah, I think a lot of people can love you and still be comfortable with you masked and uncomfortable with you unmasked. And the question is, how do they respond more than do they just like full acceptance, arms wide open? Um, and I think this goes into like once you unmask, you'll know who you are. Again, that I'm gonna say cult of authenticity, cult of individuality here in America. This idea that once you stop masking, you get to be your fuller, more wonderful, 100% authentic, honest self is like most people don't know who that person is. And there's this idea that that is a thing, and I'm sort of skeptical of, like, I think people have values, I think people have ethics, I think we follow, our own sort of ethos, and for a lot of us, depending on why we were masking, we might not have had much time to develop that, and so sometimes we are still learning and growing, and I would hope that at 37 years old, I'm still learning and growing, and that when I'm 47, I'll be different than I am today. And so you'll know exactly who you are is a bit of a misnomer because who you are today hopefully changes in the future as a natural process of growth. Um, but again, I mean, a lot of us start masking young before our brains are fully developed. We're unmasking around other people who are not fully developed. And there's a protective nature for it. I masked a lot because I grew up religious in a setting that didn't make sense to my neurodivergent brain. And under the threat of going to hell, I did have to fit in. I grew up lower socioeconomic status than a lot of my peers. There was effort and a safety to fit in. I think um, I didn't know that then. I couldn't have understood money. I didn't know what my family was worth versus other families. I knew that my best friend had a trampoline and a pool and a Nintendo 64, and I didn't have any of those things. So we were going to hang out at their house because their house was more fun. Um, so I think some of that stuff is like, I don't know. Oftentimes, you as a neurodivergent person are going to spend so much time masking that when you get the opportunity to unmask, you're going to sort of be like, yeah, I don't know who I am because I don't know what my authentic self is because I spent so much time masking. I was spending so much time and energy learning how to fit in that now that I don't feel that pressure to fit in, now that I have safe spaces, I have people around me who are securely attached to me where I can unmask, I don't necessarily know what that looks like. And again, a lot of times it's not like sometimes it's like throwing off chains and it's wonderful and lovely. And I think when we talk about masking with queer identity, then when you unmask, when you start leaning into that queer identity, people get more and more queer. It's not that they're getting more and more queer; it's that they're more and more comfortable shedding that mask, that social norming fit that they had to fit in. And as they become their more comfortable self, more of that authentic self comes to the forefront. But also, I would say like that tends to be a growth process as opposed to be a light switch that turns on and off. I felt great when I came out as an atheist and let go of that fundamentalist religion. And like that was a years long process. So when I finally said it out loud, especially to people in my life, I was more than ready for it. And so it might have seemed like a light switch to them, but there was a lot of internal work and a lot of work in therapy and reading books and growing myself before I was at that point. So I think, yeah, I don't love that one either. I don't love anything that pushes sort of the idea that authenticity is like better and therefore we should do it all the time. Um, the last one I wrote down is a sort of silly, simple one, but you can just stop asking. You can just stop. Just quit it. Knock it off. That's not how it works for anything. Feeling feelings, thinking thoughts. Masking is not always a conscious thing. Part of unmasking is getting to that point where we can slow down our thought process enough to notice it and decide whether it is aligned with our values and our ethics and makes sense in that context. But oftentimes it's sort of impulse, it's sort of automatic. And again, it can be masking queerness, it can be masking neurodivergence, it can be masking emotion, it can be masking dysregulation, it can be masking burnout. There's a ton of different things, a ton of different ways that masking shows up. But um, I think there's this cult, especially on social media, around authenticity as like the preferred status. And again, As a neurodivergent person, as a neurodivergent therapist who works with a lot of late diagnosed folks, I want you to have your neuro tribe of, queer, non-conforming anarchists, right? Whatever that looks like in your life, whatever people who unmask and can be authentic with you and love, not just can tolerate, but can really dig, can really appreciate your quirks and idiosyncrasies, and whatever that approximation of your authentic self is. Like I love that. I'm not opposed to authenticity. I just don't think it's this thing that is like fully formed right away and people can just move into it smoothly and easily. I think a lot of burnout happens because we get to a place where we can unmask and then we realize how much work we put into masking, and unmasking is also a lot of work. And so again, it's often I talk about homeostasis. It's sort of shifting things, realigning, shifting again, realigning. It's rarely a light switch for people. Building community and forming relationships takes time. So as we find those communities, we can lean in a little bit more, certainly. And I think that's healthy and good. And it's not a light switch. So um, that's what I have around masking. Just some thoughts, some noticings on what's up in my social media algorithms, what I'm hearing from clients, the things sort of people wrestle with in the work that I do with them. Some things that I wanted to respond to, and taking a break from the world's on fire and everything's terrible. Um, Ultimately, I love talking about mental health more than I like talking about current events. It's just that so many current events are bad for our mental health. So, you know, we might be back next week with a Supreme Court video. I'm joking. I'm not joking. I don't know what I'm doing next week, but I really hope it's not a Supreme Court video because yuck, that's my least favorite. But yes, find your people and unmask to the level that you're comfortable, and lean in, but understand it's and appreciate that it's okay for that to be a process and not an event. All right, y'all, take care of yourself, take care of somebody else. Peace.